We read in the final verses of Daniel chapter 5 that very night Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Darius, or you may know him as Darius, they're both correct, is referred to as King Darius throughout the chapter, and his administrative acts bear all of the trappings of ultimate rule. For example, the law that Darius made that he alone should be the object of prayers and petitions would seem impossible if he were not the absolute monarch of the Persian Empire. There are, however, three problems with this scenario. First, archaeological evidence reveals that Cyrus was king of Persia when Babylon fell in 539 BC. Second, there is no mention of this particular Darius in the archaeological record. There are later Dariuses, but not this one at this time. And finally, the Bible itself repeatedly states that Cyrus was king of Persia at the time of the return from exile. And Daniel himself mentions Cyrus 3 times, including here in Daniel chapter 6. Look down at verse 28. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So who is Darius the Mede? Well, there appear to be 3 main options. The first option, adopted by liberal scholars over the past century and a half, is that the author of this book simply invented him. The prevailing opinion of liberal scholars is that the book of Daniel was written sometime in the 2nd century BC, not the 6th century BC, and that it's the fictional story of a fictional Jew living during the Babylonian exile, and that it was intended to encourage the Jews who were living in the 2nd century Antiochian persecution. Now, how actual Jews suffering actual persecution and death are supposed to be encouraged by a fictional account of fictional persecution is beyond me, but the unbelief of man and Old Testament scholars knows no bounds. Furthermore, liberal scholars once claimed that Belshazzar from Daniel chapter 5 was a figment of some anonymous 2nd century author's imagination as well. That was until about 100 years ago when cuneiform tablets were dug up out of the sand that bore Belshazzar's name and proved his existence and his reign at the time of Babylon's fall. If we assume rather that this book of Daniel is the inspired and inerrant Holy Spirit, God-breathed account, an assumption supported by a growing mass of historical archaeological evidence, then there are really only 2 options left to us. The first is that Darius is the throne name for a Persian general named Ugbaru, the general whom the Nabonidus Chronicle, that's that artifact pictured on the screen, an important extra-biblical artifact. That artifact claims that this Ugbaru, a Median general, orchestrated the fall of Babylon, and that Cyrus the Persian appointed him to rule in Babylon in his stead as something of a sub-king or a co-regent. That view has a lot of scholarly support behind it. The second good option is that Darius the Mede is actually Cyrus the Persian. This view was originally propounded by a scholar named D.J. Wiseman, who argued that Daniel 6:28, that verse we just read a moment ago, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian, should actually be translated, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, that is Cyrus the Persian. That's a perfectly acceptable rendering of the Hebrew text. It's the way it's rendered, for instance, in 1 Chronicles 5:26. Furthermore, we know from extra-biblical sources like the Nabonidus Chronicle that Cyrus was about 62 years old at the time of the conquest of Babylon, which is the same age Daniel 5:31 gives for Darius the Mede at the very same time. Now, which of those last two options is correct? I don't know. It doesn't affect the interpretation of this chapter. But I tell you that in order to assure you that there is every reason to believe that this Darius was a real historical figure and that this account accurately describes a real historical event. Now, with Darius' identity established, at least as best as we can, let's proceed on to the text. Many commentators have noted that Daniel 6 is very similar to Daniel 3. Think about it. In Daniel 3, we have Hebrew exiles, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They're faced with a threat to their covenant faithfulness resulting from a king's idolatrous vanity, Nebuchadnezzar's golden image. Their faithfulness to God, even in the midst of that threat, provokes the malice of their fellow court officials, the Chaldeans, who accuse them to the king. Daniel 3:12, these men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. The king sentences them to certain death in the fiery furnace, yet they are miraculously delivered by God. They are unharmed without even the smell of smoke upon them. And this results in the king's proclamation of praise to Yahweh, Daniel 3:29. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. In Daniel chapter 6, we find almost a mirror reflection. We have a Hebrew exile, Daniel, faced with a threat to his covenant faithfulness that results from a king's idolatrous vanity, the ordinance that no one should pray to any god or man other than Darius. His faithfulness to God in the face of this threat provokes the malice of fellow court officials, the high officials and the satraps, who accuse him to the king, Daniel 6:13. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, same words, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. The king sentences him to certain death in the lion's den. Yet he is miraculously delivered by God. No harm was found on him, kind of like the smell of smoke was not even on his garments. And this results in the king's proclamation of praise to Yahweh. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. The 2 chapters are mirror images of one another. So you might ask, what's the purpose of recording both events? Is Daniel 6 redundant? Yes. But therein lies the point. It doesn't matter which kingdom of this world you live in or under which king you live. You will always be in exile, and you will always be subject to this world's unrelenting opposition to God, to his kingdom, and to his people. Whether Babylon or Persia or Greece or Rome or the godless culture in which we live, until Christ returns in victory over the kingdoms of this world to establish his everlasting throne upon the earth, we will be exiles, hated by this world, faced with constant tribulations and trials of our faith. How will we remain faithful? That's the question. Well, just as we studied how Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah remained faithful, noting that it was because of their steadfast faith in God's omnipotence, his freedom, and his faithfulness that they were able to stand before the most powerful man in the world and make the good confession. Even so, here in Daniel chapter 6, we can observe how Daniel stood in the midst of his trial and remained faithful. And we can derive lessons in the same way. So I'm going to draw out of Daniel chapter 6 5 elements of faithfulness in exile. If you want to be faithful in your exile, faithful in your life in the midst of the hostility of this world and the trials and tribulations that will come upon you, these 5 things need to be true of you. Number 1, faithfulness in exile requires personal integrity. Daniel's personal integrity is demonstrated throughout this chapter, but is specifically highlighted in verses 1 to 3. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. By the time Darius conquered Babylon, his empire was exceedingly vast. And so in order to administrate such a kingdom, he divided it into 120 administrative districts, grouped into 3 broad realms. The administrative structure was designed to foster accountability and to prevent fraud, so that the king might suffer no loss. Taxation is the prerogative of conquering kingdoms, and there would have been a lot of revenue flowing up the chain of command to Darius. But in an empire spread across much of the ancient Near East, the opportunity was ripe for sticky hands and blind eyes. Dale Ralph Davis sarcastically comments, quote, "Here at least is one constant unchanging reality amid all the flux and upheaval of history. Governments are huge repositories of waste, graft, and corruption." It's a cynical view, but it seems right. At any rate, Daniel was placed in charge of one of those 3 main divisions and was tasked with maintaining the integrity of the revenues. So his very placement in that position speaks to his personal integrity and his reputation for integrity. But then Daniel continues to rise to the top of the civil service. And I want you to remember that Daniel's 80 years old by the time of Daniel chapter 6. He's no young pup. He distinguished himself in his position to such an extent that Darius plans to make him prime minister of the entire kingdom. Not unlike Joseph as prime minister of Egypt many centuries before. Why? Well, it says because an excellent spirit was in him. An excellent spirit. Excellent spirit refers to more than integrity. It also implies competence, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But it absolutely demands integrity. And as we come to find out, Daniel's personal integrity was public knowledge, and it stood up to the scrutiny of his enemies. Look at verse 4. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Error and fault are difficult words to translate. They're not used a whole lot in the Hebrew Old Testament, but it seems that the first, error, has to do with incompetence, and fault has to do with corruption. There was no incompetence and there was no corruption found in Daniel. The high officials and the lower satraps scoured Daniel's timesheets and ledgers, his receipts and his logs. They searched his hard drives with a fine-toothed comb and interviewed his employees and his colleagues, and they found nothing. His character was impeccable, his integrity intact. Beloved, if we are to live faithfully while in exile here in Babylon, we must possess personal integrity. This world will seek for anything to discredit our character and to discredit our gospel. Having spent over 13 years in pastoral ministry, I am keenly aware of the way that the world rejoices to see a pastor fall into some manner of immorality or indecency. Why? Why does the world delight in the downfall of a ministry, the destruction of a church, and the disintegration of a family? It's so that they can slap the hypocrite label on such a man, invalidate his message, and thereby justify their own sin and unbelief. And this is true not only of pastors, it's true of all public Christians. And all real Christians are public Christians. The world wants to see you fall. See? I knew it. She's a hypocrite just like the rest of them. You know the church is full of hypocrites. When the world looks for dirt on you, it is imperative that they find none. Not because we have hidden our sins, but because there's nothing to find. Now, I want to be clear. I am not saying that you must be perfect. Integrity is not the same thing as perfection. Integrity is not sinlessness. Daniel was neither perfect nor sinless, but he was faithful, verse 4, and he was blameless, verse 22. In other words, there was no difference between the public Daniel and the private Daniel. They were one and the same man. And the same must be true of us as well. There must be no distinction between who we are in public and who we are in private, between who we are at church and who we are at home. When you sin, and you will, own it. Confess it. Seek forgiveness from and reconciliation with those you have hurt. But do not hide your sin, because be sure it will come out. The world will find it. In fact, Luke 8:17 says God will see to it. We need to be people of personal integrity, which does not mean perfection, does not mean sinlessness. It means we're the same publicly as we are privately. We own our sin, we confess it, we repent of it, and we present to the world a whole picture of who we are, not a mask. Second, faithfulness in exile requires not only personal integrity, it requires professional competence. Look again at verse 4. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Now, I mentioned ago that I believe error refers to incompetence and fault refers to corruption. The NIV, I think, captures the sense of this verse by stating that Daniel was neither corrupt nor negligent. The antidote to corruption is integrity, and the antidote to negligence is competence. Integrity is not enough. If Daniel possessed integrity but not competence, then what good would he have been to Darius, his employer? Daniel needed not only to be honest, he needed to be capable. He had to be capable of administrating the kingdom, as well as capable of resisting the temptation to embezzle some of the revenue that flowed up through him. I'm convinced that competence is an overlooked quality of faithfulness to God. Listen to me. God does not just call you to be honest in your job, He calls you to be good at it. Why? Well, number one, because your job, your work, your labor is a stewardship from God. And number two, because it's a witness to the world. Ecclesiastes 9:10, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. There's no excuse not to put forth your best effort at work, students, at school, or at home, or in whatever it is that your hand finds for you to do. Seek knowledge, seek wisdom, and put it to good use. Recognize that you don't ultimately work for man, you work for God. Colossians 3:22, bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity, that is integrity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. Jesus is your boss. Laziness is not a fruit of the Spirit. I've read Galatians 5 a lot of times and I don't see it in there. but faithfulness is. God has given you your job, and ultimately you work for Him. The Lord Christ is your master. So work in such a way as to be pleasing to Him. Put forth your best effort. Become an expert in your field. There's no reason not to. Wisdom's available, knowledge is available, instruction's available, help is available. Become an expert in your field. Be the best. Learn to become more efficient and effective, more professional and more productive. Laziness, apathy, and dishonesty are endemic in today's workforce. Everybody's trying to do the least amount of work possible and still maintain their job and get their paycheck. Be different. Work in such a way that brings Him glory. A second reason to pursue professional competence is for the sake of your witness in the world. Nothing will set you apart from your unbelieving colleagues and co-workers and open doors to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, 1 Peter 3:15, like professional competence. Clock in on time. Don't abuse sick days. Take pride in your work. Take care of the company's equipment as though it were your own. Learn to be more efficient and effective, and you'll stick out on the workforce like a sore thumb because nobody else is doing it. That's why God has left you in exile in Babylon rather than whisking you home to Zion, in order that you might be a witness to the gospel among the Babylonians. Now, be forewarned, this is not going to make you popular. It's going to provoke jealousy and hostility from the world. Your lazy co-workers are going to hate you because you're going to make them look bad. This is what happened in the case of Daniel. But to this you have been called. Philippians 2:14, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. The world does not appreciate shining lights because it exposes their darkness. Your co-workers are not going to love your professional competence because it exposes their incompetence. They will not love your diligence because it exposes their laziness. But that's the cost of faithfulness in Babylon. Do not stoop to the world's work ethic. Rise up to Christ's. Third, faithfulness in exile requires a public witness. Daniel's faithfulness to God was public knowledge, and this is demonstrated in 4 ways in this chapter. Look at verse 5. Then these men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. Isn't that a fascinating statement? I almost said compliment because that's what it is. Daniel was so personally honest and professionally competent. He was so faithful. There was no error or fault to be found in him. He was neither corrupt nor negligent, NIV. Therefore, the only way that these officials and satraps could get rid of him was by creating a conflict between Daniel's allegiance to his boss, that is Darius, and Daniel's allegiance to his God, that is Yahweh. And that's precisely what they did. They concocted what Dale Davis calls Darius Appreciation Month. Verse 6, then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction. Now, why would Darius establish such an asinine decree? I mean, it's a stupid idea. Well, on the one hand, I think we could point to his vanity. These officials are obviously appealing to Darius's pride. I mean, they don't have to make Darius the focal point of all religious activity. There are other ways to accomplish their ends. For instance, the ordinance could have stipulated that no one was to sacrifice to any god but Darius's god, but that's not what they say. I think there's another factor, though, and that's the potential political benefit to this injunction. You remember that Darius' conquest of Babylon was very recent, and some unifying activity would be desirable to foster loyalty among his newly conquered subjects. Ian Duguid, an Old Testament commentator, suggests that, quote, most likely Darius viewed this law as a political rather than a religious edict, a means of uniting the realm by identifying himself as the sole mediator between the people and the gods, the source of their every blessing. This edict thus functions similarly to Nebuchadnezzar's enormous golden statue in Daniel chapter 3. So most scholars agree that the purpose of this injunction is not to declare Darius to be a god, but rather it makes him something of the high priest of Persia for a period of 30 days, the one mediator between the gods and men. Now, the answer as to why Darius would agree to this suggestion probably lies somewhere between his own personal vanity and political savvy. But whatever the reason, the motive of the officials is their confidence that Daniel's steadfast allegiance to his God will prevent him from obeying the injunction. They're confident that Daniel will be faithful to God. Whether the purpose of the law is to declare Darius divine or demand that he alone be worshipped, or to declare Darius the high priest of the gods and the only mediator by which those gods may be worshipped, this is a step that Daniel simply cannot and will not take. He cannot and he will not participate in such pagan nonsense. And his enemies know it, and that's the point. They know of Daniel's devotion to his God, and they know that if they can create a conflict between Daniel's allegiance to Darius the king and to Yahweh, the God of Israel, they'll have him. The second evidence of Daniel's public witness is demonstrated by his actions when he heard of the ordinance. Look at verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. They came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, "O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?" And the king answered and said, "The thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked." Then they answered and said before the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." 2 very important phrases in verse 10 demonstrate Daniel's public witness. The first is when Daniel knew that the document had been signed. He went and he prayed. In other words, Daniel was not ignorant of the injunction. He wasn't caught off guard when the officials reported him to the king. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had counted the cost of his public witness. The second important phrase is, as he had done previously. Neither then did Daniel force this public confrontation by praying in a way to which he was not accustomed. That would have been hypocrisy. Rather, what Daniel did was, knowing the injunction, knowing the cost, knowing that it would likely result in a horrible death, Daniel continued to do what he had always done. 3 times a day, he ascended to the upper chamber of his house. He opened the windows towards Jerusalem, and he prayed and he gave thanks to his God. Now, it's interesting to note that there is a prayer of Daniel's recorded in Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9, which also comes from the first year of Darius's reign. Now, even if it's not the same prayer, it's surely indicative of what's on Daniel's heart during that time. And in that prayer, we find that Daniel is praying for the redemption of Israel and for the restoration of Jerusalem. Now, why does he face Jerusalem in this prayer? Well, he's consciously fulfilling Solomon's prayer from 1 Kings chapter 8 at the dedication of the temple. Solomon had said in 1 Kings 8:46, "If they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you are angry with them and give them to an enemy, so that they are carried away captive to the land of their enemies, far off or near. Yet if they turn their heart in the land to which they have been carried captive and repent and plead with you in the land of their captors, saying, 'We have sinned and have acted perversely and wickedly,' if they repent with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies who carried them captive, and pray to you toward their land, the land which you gave to their fathers, the city that you have chosen, and the house that I have built for your name, then hear in heaven your dwelling place their prayer and their plea, and maintain their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you, and all their transgressions that they have committed against you, and grant them compassion in the sight of those who have carried them captive, that they may have compassion upon them. For they are your people and your heritage, which you brought out of Egypt from the midst of the iron furnace." Daniel's praying out of obedience and in hope that what Solomon had prayed for in 1 Kings chapter 8 would come to pass. And one gets the impression that this had been Daniel's habit since the time he had been carried into exile. For nearly 70 years, 3 times a day, if you had walked past Daniel's home, you would have witnessed him praying, pleading, and giving thanks to his God. That's a consistent public witness. And that's what it takes to be faithful in exile. A third way in which Daniel's public witness is demonstrated can be found in the accusation to the officials, or of the officials rather, to the king. Verse 13. "Then they answered and said before the king, 'Daniel,'" and note this, "'who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you.'" Now Daniel's been in exile for 70 years. He spent 70 years in Babylon and 15 years in Israel. 70 years in exile, and Daniel is still not a Babylonian. Note that. He is still known publicly as an exile from Judah. He's still known as an Israelite. That may be some racial bias, but I suspect it has more to do with Daniel's religious devotion, which was well known to the people of Babylon. Daniel was famous for his devotion to the God of Israel and for his refusal to violate the law of his God. Ask yourself this question: do my neighbors, my coworkers, my family, do they know that I'm different, that I'm not like them? Do they know that I'm a follower of Christ? Do they know where I am every Sunday morning? Do they know what my source of authority is? Do they know who my ultimate allegiance is to? Do they know? They knew about Daniel. Finally, Daniel's public witness is demonstrated in the way Darius, who has known Daniel, note this, less than a year. He knows where Daniel's ultimate allegiance lies. So the third and the fourth kind of function like this. The Babylonians who've witnessed Daniel for 70 years, they know where his allegiance lies because he had a long track record of allegiance and devotion and faithfulness to God. So too do the newbies. They also know. Which tells you that Daniel's very public about his faith. Look with me at, there we go. Verse 14. "Then the king, when he'd heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, 'Know, O king,'" they can see that he's wavering a little bit. "'Know, O king, that is the law of the Medes and Persians, that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed.' Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel," watch this, "'May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you.' And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet ring of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Isn't that a wonderful commendation of Daniel's public witness? The king of Persia, who has known Daniel for less than a year, not only has such affection for Daniel that he almost can't bear to carry out the injunction, he can't sleep that night knowing where Daniel is, but he can also declare, "May your God whom you serve continually deliver you." Faithfulness in exile requires the maintaining of a continuous public witness. There is no such thing as a private Christian. This public witness will win the respect of a few, like Darius, and the hostility of many, like the officials. But whether our public witness results in the promotion of our promotion or our death, we dare not violate the law of our God. Fourth, faithfulness in exile requires private devotion. This is the necessary counterpart to our public witness. Our external acts of righteousness are mere hypocrisy if they're not joined to an internal heart of righteousness. Now, there's no one verse in this chapter that explicitly demonstrates Daniel's private devotion, but that's kind of the point, isn't it? It's private. No one would have known but Daniel. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "For I tell you," Matthew 5:20, "unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven." What's wrong with the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees? It's entirely external and public. It is not internal and private. Jesus immediately then proceeds in Matthew chapter 5 to contrast external formal righteousness with internal authentic righteousness. Right? To not kill your brother means nothing if you harbor secret anger and bitterness against him. Matthew 5:21-26. To not commit adultery means nothing if you secretly burn with lust. Matthew 5:27-30. To legally divorce your wife is still adultery if you did so only in order that you might marry another woman. Matthew 5:31-32. Jesus then says, Matthew 6:1, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Therefore," he says, "when you give to the poor, sound no trumpet before you as the hypocrites in the synagogues and in the streets do, that they may be praised by others. And do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. When you pray," he says, "don't stand in the synagogues or the street corners to be seen by others, but pray in secret. When you fast, don't let everyone know what a sacrifice you're making or how weak and hungry you are, but act normally, and let that fast be between you and your God." External righteousness without internal righteousness, public witness without private devotion means nothing. It's hypocrisy. Yet there are three indications that Daniel's devotion was private even while his witness was public. Three indications that Daniel's righteousness exceeded the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. First, verse 5, there's the statement of the officials. "Then these men said, 'We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find in connection with the law of his God.'" Now, I'm convinced that the people of this world can sniff out hypocrisy. They have kind of a hypocrisy radar. Why? Because they're hypocrites themselves, right? I mean, they know it when they see it. They can detect it, and they're quite adept at finding that chink in the armor of our external righteousness. So notice what these officials do not say. They don't say, "Well, we need only dig deeper to find the end of Daniel's integrity. We simply haven't found the right leverage yet, the right price, the right prostitute, the right provocation. Find the chink in Daniel's armor and we'll own him." They knew intuitively there was no chink because his righteousness was not merely external. It went all the way down. It was of one piece with Daniel himself. They knew that there was one way and one way only to bring Daniel down. They needed to place Daniel on the horns of a dilemma. They needed to manufacture a conflict between Daniel's faithfulness to his king and Daniel's faithfulness to his God. The second indication was that Daniel's devotion was private, even while his witness was public, comes in verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. And so that last phrase, as he had done previously, that hints at Daniel's private devotion. Who would have known that but Daniel himself, the author of this book? Now, sure, that the officials seem to be aware of Daniel's habit of thrice daily prayer, but there's no indication that they had spies who day in and day out watched Daniel's daily routine. In other words, this phrase seems to be Daniel's own indication of his daily personal private devotion, whether or not anyone else was watching. Now listen, it's impossible that our private devotion, if consistent and regular and unyielding, won't eventually become public knowledge. It's impossible that if we're in the habit of rising early every morning to read our Bible and pray, that one of our kids isn't going to get up and see it. It's okay. It's good. If it's your habit on your lunch break to head out to your car and to open up your Bible and read while you eat your lunch, and one of your coworkers comes upon and finds you doing it, that's okay. That's good. Because it's not the reason why you did it. Right? That's the difference. Jesus is not saying that your righteousness must never be observed when he says, beware of practicing your righteousness before men. Of course it's going to be observed, but that's not the motivation for doing it. As we have seen, Daniel did not throw open the windows of his upper chamber and pray vain and empty words to be seen and observed. He simply continued what he always did, his thrice daily habit of praying, pleading, and giving thanks to his God. Your public witness will bring you into irreconcilable conflict with the world, but only your private devotion will sustain you unto death. And therein lies the third indication of Daniel's private devotion. He did not flinch before the lions. In fact, he doesn't appear to say much of anything at all. He accepts his fate, whatever it may be, as the faithful, free, and sovereign will of his God. Public witness will get you thrown into the lion's den, but only private devotion will prevent you from wailing like a coward on the way. Only private devotion will enable you to gracefully and courageously accept whatever outcome God wills. Because it's only through private devotion, it's only through private fellowship with your God, through the word and prayer, that you receive the grace to persevere, which brings us to the fifth and final essential element of faithfulness in exile. Faithfulness in exile requires persevering grace. The strength to persevere doesn't reside in you. It's not natural to sinful man. It is given by God's grace through God's Spirit. Daniel persevered through this trial because God preserved him through this trial. And I think this truth is graphically depicted in the conclusion of this chapter. Look at verse 19. Then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and you have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Note that, because he had trusted in his God. Not because he was a natural lion tamer, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they and their children and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Neither did Daniel survive, because the lions were full. As we saw in Daniel chapter 3 in the account of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in the fiery furnace, sometimes God's preserving grace manifests itself in deliverance from death. Other times it manifests itself in deliverance through death. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were delivered from the flames, but as we saw, many others, no less faithful than they, have been consumed in the flames. Similarly, Daniel was preserved from the lions. Church history tells us that many, no less faithful than Daniel, were consumed by the lions. Yet in all cases, God's preserving grace proved sufficient and determinative. They made the good confession, they suffered so far as God's sovereign will determined, and they'll be saved on the day of judgment. Faithfulness in exile is not finally dependent upon your own strength. It is finally dependent upon God's preserving grace. And that is good news, especially if your reaction to Daniel 3 or Daniel 6 is, I don't think I could ever be that brave. I don't think I could ever be that courageous. Listen, dare to be a Daniel is not the application of this text. The application is trust in Daniel's God. Make his God your God. Daniel himself points to that application in verse 23. So Daniel was taken out of the den. No kind of harm was found on him. Why? Because he trusted in his God. And so must you. And if the question is asked, why does God ordain that his people suffer in exile? Why doesn't he just redeem them from exile and bring them to their homeland? Why does the Lord tarry? Why has Christ not yet returned? Why has his church endured all of this trial and all of this tribulation, all of this suffering and affliction for the last 2,000 years? The answer, I believe, is found in the last few verses of the last several chapters. We saw it at the end of chapter 2. At the end of chapter 3, at the end of chapter 4, and we see it again here at the end of chapter 6. God is making a name for himself among the nations, and he's using the suffering of his people to do it. He is spreading the knowledge of his glory over the earth as the waters cover the seas, Habakkuk 2:14. He did it with Nebuchadnezzar, he's doing it here with Darius. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and of his dominion there shall be no end. He delivers and he rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Who knows how many Babylonians and Persians came to saving knowledge of God because of the testimony of faithful Israelite exiles? Who knows how many unbelievers of this world would come to saving faith of Christ because of the faithful witness of Christ's church during these long years of exile? Who knows which of your co-workers, which of your family, which of your neighbors, which of your friends God intends to reveal himself to through your faithful witness? If you trace it back far enough, is that not how you came to faith? You were once a Babylonian yourself, but observing the faithful witness of some Christian exile. Your parents, your family, a friend, a neighbor, faithful church members. You came to trust in their God and in his Christ. Your faithfulness, in other words, it's not just about you. Your faithfulness is also about your neighbors, and it's about the nations. Daniel chapter 6 is a call to the Church of Jesus Christ, to First Baptist Nixa, to be found faithful to the very end. For it's the one who perseveres to the end who will be saved. And in persevering to the end, so will the nations.